Welcome, folks, to another episode of Stories from Science. So we've been looking at science from all sides, from different perspectives. And what's our stories going to be about today? Well, it's not only in science. We are going to look at controversies, particularly in science. But what we do know, and it has been said, that no great advance has ever occurred in life, whether it's in science, politics, or religion, without a certain amount of controversy. As a matter of fact, you can tell the passion and the investment in a topic when it evokes more controversy. And when it comes to science, it's something that affects all of us. So let's take a look today at what are some of the few controversies in science and the scientists and issues that have been affected. And those of you who may be joining us today for the first time, and I hope you're not, that you've been catching up with this series, who's my guest today? Welcome, you are my guest, and you will play along with me as we have done in the other episodes. And what we do is I'm going to make a statement, and you're going to have to decide, is it false or is it true? And that will cue us to our story. And then we'll see by the end of the story whether the statement was true or false. So welcome, folks, again to a very important topic that affects all our lives. And when you think about it from the perspective of science, there is almost nothing. You never had complete consensus many thousands of years ago on the origin of life. How did life come to be? What was our universe, our solar system? How does it operate? Everything had so much controversies around it. Is there alchemy? Evolution continues to be a controversial topic. We've covered it in other episodes. And then as we come to the modern day technologies in medicine, things like stem cells and all of these things. And which one of us can forget even COVID-19 that we've all lived through had quite its own share of controversies with the vaccinations and things like that. So it's what makes life engaging, interesting, and that back and forth actually can add a lot of value. But at other times, it can also be very detrimental. I want to quote to you some words from Michael Faraday, right? Big scientist in the world of physics. And he said, "I have a great distaste for controversy. I've often seen it do great harm, and yet remember a few cases in natural knowledge where it has helped much, either to pull down error or advance truth. Criticism, on the other hand, is of much value." So we must not be afraid of controversy or criticism. So let's get started. Here's my first statement. Galileo was put to death on being charged with heresy for believing the earth revolved around the sun. And today I've got my sun, I've got my earth. So let me read that for you again. Is it true or false? Galileo was put to death on being charged with heresy for believing the earth revolved around the sun. Today, I don't think anyone doubts that is the correct picture, that the earth revolves around the sun. But in Galileo's time, in 1600s, and for thousands of years before, they believed that the sun orbited planet Earth, right? And it had a lot of connection with religious belief that we were the most important, and therefore Earth must be at the center and not the sun. But Galileo today, not too different from this. So a telescope, he's the first person to actually look at the heavens through a telescope. He used a telescope about this size, and when he looked, he saw Jupiter's moons, and he saw that Jupiter's moons were orbiting Jupiter. He saw craters on the moon, and he saw sunspots, things no one had ever seen before. And all of these things, he started to realize that, you know what? The correct picture is that the sun is in the center and Earth orbits around it. So when he wrote about this, when he spoke about this, this brought on the ires of the authorities, and at the time the Catholic Church, and an inquisition took place. And in 1633, the Vatican, they condemned Galileo for his belief that the earth revolved around the sun. It was so controversial, and they threatened to burn him at stake. But what happened was that Galileo agreed to not promote his belief. He recanted it, and for that he got a lesser sentence of house arrest, and he was not allowed to teach what he believed, and his books were banned. And they were banned not just for, like I like to tell my students, 10 years or 50 years, folks. His book was banned for 190 years, right? So the statement that Galileo was put to death on being charged with heresy for believing the earth revolved around the sun is actually false. Did you get why? Because he was not put to death. He was actually put under house arrest, and which is very tragic, and he died blind several years later. Now, the story doesn't end there, because it is one of the hallmark stories, the controversies between science and religion. And 359 years later, the Catholic Church actually in 1992 issued an apology to Galileo that he had not been treated fairly, and the recognition that his scientific beliefs were actually correct. And for that, he was charged with vehemently believing in heresy. So that's one of our first stories of a very controversial issue that happened hundreds of years ago, and we took 359 years to apologize for it. All right, so are you ready for our next statement? Let's go. Okay, so I'm moving like a bit forward in time. So Galileo is about 1600s. So let's move to about the 1800s, late 1800s. And here's my statement, and I'll explain it, but let me read it first. Eugenics was practiced in America into the 1970s. So is that statement true or false? So if you're not too sure what eugenics is, eugenics was a belief and a practice that inferior people should not be allowed to reproduce. And yes, it sends a chill down our spine that we've come through controversial issues like that. So I read back what the statement is for you to decide if it is false or is it true. Eugenics was practiced in America into the 1970s. All right, so let's talk about eugenics now. So eugenics is an inaccurate theory that believed, after they began to see that genetics played a role, people began to believe that all kinds of traits was passed. So if you had criminal tendencies, you should not be allowed to reproduce. If they thought that you were not very smart, and who's to decide these things, you were not allowed to reproduce. And this remained in practice for a very, very, very long time. And we will see that is my statement true or false. And interestingly, the whole thing was proposed by none other than Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory himself, his cousin Galton, in 1883. And you had so many supporters of the eugenics theory, or I will say point of view. You actually had politicians, you had leaders in society, you even had Nobel laureates agreeing with this point of view. Folks, this is one of the sad turning points in our history of science, because this led to tremendous racism, discrimination, and some of it still remains with us, and this made it normalized. It normalized it so much that it was on the heels of the eugenics theory that we've seen the terrible atrocities in Hitler's Nazi Germany. And that was eugenics. So back to the question of my statement, eugenics was practiced in America into the 1970s. Is it true or false? Hard as it is to believe, folks, it's true. 1970s into late 1970s, there were states where it was legal to be able to ban people against their will from reproducing. So our journey into the technological era that we are in and the science that we understand has not been without controversy. All right, okay, so tied to the topic of eugenics, I'm going to give you another statement. And listen to this one. A Chinese scientist was sent to prison for creating the world's first gene-edited babies. Is that true or false? Let's go again. A Chinese scientist was sent to prison for creating the world's first gene-edited babies. So what is this about? So this is in reference to a particular Chinese scientist, and this is a very current story, very current. His name is He Jiankui, and it's on the heel of a new technology called CRISPR technology or gene editing. And this was just in about 2012. It's a very recent thing. Nobel Prize was awarded for this discovery. What scientists discovered is that they could splice your DNA, and if there were defective genetic components, it could be taken out and you were now editing, doing gene editing of humans. Do you see the controversy, how controversial this can be? It leads it's a different version. This is scientifically, not eugenics was more socially created theory. But in this case, the issue became, do we create designer babies? Do people want certain eye colors? And who's to decide what's right or wrong? What a slippery slope. So is that statement true or false? That the Chinese scientist was sent to prison for creating the world's first gene-edited babies. And did you get this? It's actually true. So what happened is that He Jiankui was working, he's a biophysicist, a biomedical person, and he knew how to do the CRISPR technology. And then he went back to China, and there were this family that had a history of a certain disease which could be corrected by doing gene editing in the embryo. And there are no rules, no ethic boards or any system in place as to how we deal with this, but he just proceeded and he announced in 2018 that he had created the world's first gene-edited babies, twin girls named Lulu and Nana. This had the whole world up in storm, and for this he was actually charged and sent to prison. He went to prison for 3 years, and for this crime, for having used unethical and irresponsible use of science. They charged him for illegal medical practices. So He Jiankui is out now in 2024, and he's back to working on diseases that could be inherited, which have a genetic component like Alzheimer's and other fatal diseases. And he continues to be a strong proponent of that, to be able to make the quality of life better, that we should be able to be allowed to do this. This is a controversial issue, and we still have ways to go before we decide what is right, what is wrong, what should be allowable. So folks, at this time, we're going to take a break before we come back to other controversial stories in science in our series, Stories from Science. So I'll see you back in just a bit. Welcome back, folks, from that little break, and you're wondering what's next in our Stories from Science on controversial stories, controversial science, controversies that scientists were embroiled in. And just before the break, we were talking about a case of from eugenics. We went to the case of where the world's first gene-edited babies have been born. Actually, it was not just two. There's a third baby. We do not have much information on that baby, but that's also in China. So let's go with the next statement, which is still tied to the topic of biomedical technology, because this is where the cutting edge science is happening right now in the field of genetics. So here's my statement. A baby with 3 parents has never been born. Folks, is that statement false or is it true? Let me repeat. A baby with 3 parents has never been born. All right, so what are we talking about? So clearly this has to do with CRISPR technology, genetic splicing, and the science does exist that if there are certain diseases inherited from the mother, there is a technique that's called mitochondrial replacement theory. And in such a case, scientists can remove the defective part of the DNA, replace it with a healthy DNA replacement part, and then the parents can go on to have a healthy baby without that defective chance of an illness in it. So has this ever been done? So when the statement was that a baby with 3 parents has never been born, do you want to change your answer? Is it false or is it true? Well, folks, a baby with 3 parents has never been born is actually false, because in 2016, this technique of mitochondrial replacement therapy was used. It was done in Mexico because the laws were less regulated there. You could not do this in America at the time, and even right now. And a healthy baby was born with genetic material from not just the mom and dad, but 3 persons. So if that child does a genetic test, their DNA will show that their parents are actually 3 persons. So these things raise a lot of controversies, and I started by saying that the Galileo case was one of the key ones when it came to the issue of religion versus science. So you can see why sometimes these things clash. Are we playing God? What is right? Right? And therefore, the conversations and the controversies continue. It is actually currently, as we speak, this process is actually legal in the United Kingdom now. All right. Okay, so let's continue with more stories of controversy and see what the next one comes from. Okay, here is my statement, and I will repeat it for you. A few drops of blood can detect hundreds of diseases. Is that true or false? Now, what's interesting about that statement? We all know if you want to do a little sugar testing, you could stick your finger and you'll be able to test that. But you know that if you want to do your blood work, your lipid tests and your cholesterol and the whole 9 yards, which we get sent to do sometimes, we all know that they take a few vials of blood. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, and they need to draw a fair amount, maybe this much blood based on the amount of tests you're doing. So in not so long ago, this lady, Elizabeth Holmes, when she was just 19, came up with this technology, right, which she claimed that all you needed was 1 or a few drops of blood to detect not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but hundreds of diseases, right? So what a game changer that would be, all right? And she was in Stanford University. 1 year later, she dropped out of the university to work full-time on her company, Theranos. And by age 31, she was worth like $9 billion, right? And that's US dollars. And she was now known to be the youngest self-made billionaire in the United States. And this thing was just taking off. And some people began to get suspicious, and they questioned her, and it was all enshrouded in secrecy that no, with competition, you can't release your secrets and your patents and whatnot. So they couldn't release what was the science behind the technology they were using. They just said that they had it and their systems could test it. Some people started to get very suspicious and investigations began. Where do you think the story is going? And I remind you, your statement was, a few drops of blood can detect hundreds of diseases. It turns out the entire thing was fraud and conspiracy that led to all this controversy. So what is the answer for our statement that a few drops of blood can detect hundreds of diseases? It's indeed very, very false. We do not have the technology to do that. So for now, folks, we are stuck with having to draw quite a syringe of blood when we need to do blood tests. And for this, Elizabeth Holmes was tried. She and her partner, she was convicted of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to over 11 years in jail. So as of May 2023, she has begun serving her sentence and also ordered to pay $452 million to all the people that were hurt by this. People invested because they believed in her, and this whole thing was nothing but a bubble, or as they say, a unicorn thing, that nothing about it was real, right? And this is very recent because she was charged she was sentenced just last year, and she's a young lady, and here we are. Right? So there's controversies in science in all types of aspects, right? As we have seen. Okay, so our stories continue, and I am now going to talk about a little bit of a different. Several of our stories actually had to do with biomedical technology because that is the cutting edge thing. That is about humans and what life is about. And we find that's why it gets embroiled in controversies, the power that the science is bringing into what scientists are able to do. So here's my last story that we'll be looking at, and here's my statement. The scientist whose code breaking saved millions of lives in World War II was convicted for personal lifestyle. Is that true or false? And who are we talking about? All right, so let me say it again for you. The clue with that statement really has to do with who is this code breaker that saved millions of lives and shortened World War II by several years. Okay, so here's the statement. The scientist whose code breaking saved millions of lives in World War II was convicted for his personal lifestyle. Folks, we are talking of none other than Alan Turing, and it's why I actually have an apple with me on the desk, so you'll see what the apple is about. So let's talk about Alan Turing. Who's he? Alan Turing was a genius and a brilliant, he's known as the father of computer science. He anticipated artificial intelligence that we're hearing so much about decades ago. Right? So this was in the 1950s. And then, of course, during the World War II, he figured out the German system and was able to break their codes. And therefore, the Allies could predict what was going to happen. And that's what actually shortened where the different attacks were going to be coming from and so on. So the machine was Enigma. And this guy was just absolutely brilliant mathematician, computer scientist, and whatnot. He developed something called the Turing test. How do you determine if you are talking to a human or an artificial intelligence? And this was decades ago in the 1950s. I mean, today in 2024, we are hearing about artificial intelligence and how it's developing. So he foresaw all of this. And so the question, so we're talking about Alan Turing, folks. So the scientist whose code breaking saved millions of lives in World War II was convicted for personal lifestyle. Is that false or true? It turns out that it's true. And for this, he could have gone to prison or undergo chemical rehabilitation. So he chose chemical rehabilitation. And 2 years after that, his housekeeper comes into his home, because he's home, and finds him unresponsive on his bed. And there's an apple on the side, and when the coroner comes in and they do all the tests and the autopsy, it's laced with cyanide, a half-eaten apple laced with cyanide and Alan Turing. So the verdict was that he took his life with all that he was suffering from. And this is a very tragic, he was only 41 at that time. So just think that if Alan Turing had continued to be with us much, much longer, the brilliance of this scientist, how much further along we would have been, maybe in our own computer science and artificial intelligence. And in 2009, the British government did apologize for the treatment that they had meted out to him. Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, he said, "We're sorry, you deserved so much better." And in 2013, 4 years later, Queen Elizabeth, or who was around at the time, of course, granted Turing a royal pardon. This was 59 years after they found him unresponsive. In 2021, they've honored him by putting his picture on a 50-pound note. So we've seen the stories of controversy in science from many different angles, from a person being controversial, to the science being controversial, to the technology being controversial, in this case, somebody's personal lifestyle being controversial, and it all plays a big part. So folks, I hope I've given you something to think about in this episode on stories of controversy in science. And I will be closing off it today, but not without a thought and a quote from Frida Adler, who's an educator and criminologist, and it's to tie in what we've been talking about. And she says, "It is not only by the questions we have answered that progress may be measured, but also by those we are still asking. The passionate controversies of one era are viewed as sterile preoccupations by another, for knowledge alters what we seek as well as what we find." So something to talk about, folks, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue with our stories from science. Bye-bye.